Let me tell you something very simple. Nations don't have friends. They have interests. When you ask why America supports Pakistan over India at times, you're not asking a political question. You're asking a business question, a strategy question, a question of global alignment. And in business, no one pays for loyalty. They pay for value. Pakistan offers leverage. America doesn't support Pakistan out of love. It's about positioning. It's about geography. It's about strategy. Pakistan is next to Afghanistan, Iran, and China. It's a pawn on the chessboard, and pawns in the right place can checkmate kings. India is a rising power. A strong, independent India that makes its own decisions, grows its own economy, and builds its own defense is not easy to control. And when you can't control someone, you hedge your bets. That's what America is doing. Support isn't always support. What looks like support may actually be pressure. Sometimes when a superpower gives aid or recognition, it's a test. It's not friendship, it's insurance. India must focus on building, not blaming. Don't waste energy on who supports whom. Build your own economy so strong, your military so sharp, your youth so inspired, that no support or sanction can stop you. Influence is the real power. America doesn't win because of weapons. It wins because it controls influence, media, narrative, alliances, markets. If India wants to lead, it must stop playing defense and start playing global influence offense. Unity is the solution, not reaction. A divided country is easy to manipulate. A united one cannot be touched. If India focuses on its own internal strength, education, innovation, entrepreneurship, leadership, then even 1,000 supports won't matter. Remember, the world doesn't respect the loud. It respects the capable. So don't ask why someone else is winning the game. Learn the game. Master the game. Change the game. Nations don't make decisions based on emotions. They move based on interests, leverage, and long-term gain. In the world of geopolitics, sympathy is just a mask. Behind every handshake, there's calculation. Behind every partnership, there's a trade-off. When a country chooses to support another, it is not driven by compassion or cultural closeness. It is driven by strategy, survival, and advantage. Look at history. Alliances shift, enemies become friends, and friends turn into rivals overnight. Not because of betrayal, but because priorities change. Today's global politics is a marketplace. Everyone is selling influence. Everyone is buying leverage. Every decision a superpower like America makes is tied to its strategic blueprint for global dominance. It doesn't matter if the other nation is democratic or authoritarian, peaceful or conflicted. If it offers access, control, or balance in a region of interest, it becomes useful. That usefulness defines the relationship. Sympathy doesn't build billion-dollar defense deals. Sympathy doesn't justify military bases. Sympathy doesn't explain the presence of intelligence operations, funding pipelines, or diplomatic cover. All of that is built on one word: strategy. It's about who can offer more value, who can keep the balance of power in check, and who can be turned into an asset temporarily or permanently. That's why countries like Pakistan, despite facing internal instability, receive consistent attention, not because the world cares more, but because their geographical location, their relationship with China, their role in Afghanistan, and their influence in the Islamic world make them useful. Strategic usefulness is the currency of modern international relations. It matters more than moral high ground or ideological alignment. And the moment that usefulness fades, so does the so-called support. India, on the other hand, is a rising power. It doesn't need constant aid. It doesn't ask for approval. It moves at its own pace, sets its own terms. That kind of independence is powerful, but it also makes others cautious. When you're not easily influenced, you're not easily controlled, and that makes strategists nervous. So to keep pressure on such independent nations, superpowers often support their rivals. It's not always to uplift the rival. Sometimes it's to keep the rising one in check. It's a way to ensure the power balance stays predictable. Global politics is not emotional. It's mathematical. Countries invest where they see returns, military, economic, or political. That's why support often goes not to the most deserving, but to the most useful. Nations don't mourn or rejoice like individuals. They calculate, they analyze, they decide. So when you see a country like America supporting another nation that seems less stable, less democratic, or even hostile to its supposed allies, don't be surprised. It's part of the plan. It's business. It's positioning. It's not about justice. It's about leverage. If one country can offer leverage over another, whether through borders, intelligence, or influence, that's enough to earn support, regardless of ideals or history. And this is why those who want to thrive on the global stage cannot afford to waste time questioning why others are favored. Instead, they must ask, what value do we bring to the table? Are we shaping markets? Are we controlling narratives? Are we leading innovation? Because these are the things that make a country impossible to ignore. In the end, the world doesn't favor the innocent. It favors the strategic. And until a nation becomes a master of its own value, influence, and positioning, it will always be questioning others' moves instead of making its own. Geopolitics is a silent game of power, strategy, and influence. It is not a world of fairness or loyalty. It is a grand chessboard where every nation is a piece and every move has a purpose. In this game, some nations become knights, some become bishops, and some, knowingly or unknowingly, become pawns. These pawns are not chosen for their strength, but for their position. Their location, resources, alliances, and vulnerabilities make them valuable tools for achieving much larger global objectives. In this strategic theater, powerful nations don't always act out of concern or justice. They act to maintain or expand influence. Superpowers like America, China, and Russia have a long history of using smaller or strategically located nations to gain an upper hand in global affairs. These nations, especially those situated near conflict zones or resource-rich regions, become instruments of pressure, distraction, or leverage. For example, Pakistan's proximity to China, India, Iran, and Afghanistan puts it in a region of intense interest. It becomes a geographic advantage, a corridor, a gateway, or a barrier, depending on how it's used. This is why countries are often supported, not because they represent strong democratic values or stability, but because they serve a role in a larger strategy. Whether it's about military access, countering the influence of a rival superpower, or managing regional conflicts, nations like Pakistan are brought into play, not necessarily for their internal strength, but for their external positioning. Superpowers look at them and think not, what are their needs, but how can we use this relationship to control the board? And sometimes, being a pawn is not even a nation's fault. It's a result of its location, its history, and its alliances. A nation may find itself constantly courted by world powers, not because it is respected, but because it is useful. This utility can mean aid, weapons, diplomatic support, or even public praise. But behind that support is a calculation, a desire to use that nation to influence another, to pressure an enemy, or to shift the balance of power in a specific direction. The same geopolitical calculation explains why alliances change so quickly. One day, a country is hailed as a strategic partner, the next, it's abandoned or sanctioned. The moment a pawn no longer serves its purpose, it is pushed aside. Loyalty does not exist in this world, only relevance. A country that fails to understand this risks being used repeatedly and then discarded, left to deal with the consequences of other people's games. This is why nations must develop long-term vision. They must recognize when they are being used and when they are truly respected. A pawn that becomes self-aware can refuse to be moved by others. It can transform itself into a power of its own, not through confrontation, but through strength, economic independence, technological innovation, military preparedness, and diplomatic maturity. That's how a country escapes being just a tool and becomes a player. But until that happens, the pawn remains part of someone else's design. And the most dangerous part is, most of the time, it doesn't even know it's a pawn. It believes the support it receives is friendship, the aid is goodwill, the partnership is equality. But the truth is every handshake is measured. Every dollar has strings. Every alliance has expectations. And if a country doesn't deliver what the power wants, influence, obedience, access, the support will vanish overnight. Understanding this is essential for any nation that wants to rise. It cannot afford to live in illusions. It must learn the game of geopolitics, master it, and eventually rewrite the rules. Otherwise, it will forever be pushed from one square to another, celebrated one day, sacrificed the next, never realizing that it was never the player, only the piece. True power comes from influence, not alliances. Influence is invisible yet undeniable. It shapes decisions without orders, bends minds without force, and moves markets without muscle. Unlike alliances, which are written in documents and spoken in speeches, influence lives in the shadows. Quiet, constant, and far more dangerous. Alliances can be broken. Treaties can be revoked. Partnerships shift with elections, economics, or ideology. But influence survives those changes. When a country has influence, it doesn't need to beg for support. Others come seeking approval, protection, or direction. It doesn't need to announce its strength. Others feel it. The strongest nations don't win because of the number of countries that sign pacts with them. They win because they control narratives, drive global trends, set the tone in media, technology, finance, and culture. That is influence. Think about how influence works in daily life. You don't trust someone because they demand loyalty. You trust them because of their consistency, their wisdom, their value. In global affairs, the same rule applies. Nations that earn respect through innovation, leadership, and results are far more powerful than those that just build military alliances or sign trade deals. Influence makes others align with you willingly, not out of fear or obligation, but because they believe it is in their best interest. Power rooted in influence is long-lasting. It's not tied to one administration or one crisis. It becomes part of the global system. For example, if a country produces the technology that powers the world, it doesn't matter how many allies it has, it becomes unavoidable. If it controls global finance or the platforms through which people communicate, then its values, decisions, and policies shape the future, even in places it has never physically entered. That is power that cannot be touched by war or disrupted by political change. On the other hand, alliances without influence are weak. They look strong on paper, but they often lack substance. Countries enter into them for temporary security, trade, or defense, but the moment priorities change, the alliance becomes fragile. We've seen time and again how nations walk away from each other when the cost of staying loyal becomes higher than the benefits. Influence, however, doesn't need to be renewed. It's embedded in systems, in education, in economy, in global thinking. It persists even when official agreements fall apart. Look at how global culture has been shaped. Fashion, films, music, language. Many of these are not forced upon the world by alliances. They spread because of influence. They carry messages, values, and beliefs. Over time, people begin to associate strength, success, and modernity with the source of that influence. When influence shapes perception, perception shapes decisions. Nations with influence don't need to impose. Their way of life becomes the ideal. Their model becomes the standard. That's a type of control no treaty can ever buy. Even in conflict, influence has greater reach. A country may be isolated by formal alliances, but if it has influence through social media, news outlets, global corporations, or intellectual leadership, it can still rally support, weaken enemies, and change outcomes. It can operate beyond borders without setting foot outside its territory. It can make others question themselves, doubt their allies, or even turn on each other, all without lifting a weapon. That's why the smartest nations in the world today are not focused only on alliances. They are building influence. They are investing in education technology, soft power, and global networks. They are telling stories, exporting ideas, building platforms, and creating systems that others rely on. Once a country controls what others depend on, be it information, innovation, or inspiration, it doesn't need to fight for support. Support comes automatically. In the modern world, influence is the true currency of power. It buys access, shapes opinions, and wins battles before they even begin. While alliances may offer temporary strength, it is influence that builds lasting dominance. Because influence doesn't just change policies, it changes minds. And once you change how the world thinks, you don't need to demand loyalty. You already have it. India must invest inward rather than react outward. The path to real power, respect, and influence does not come from constant reactions to global politics or rivalries. It comes from building a nation so strong, so self-sufficient, and so forward, thinking that no external shift can shake its core. Reactions are temporary. They are emotional responses to changing events. But investment, especially inward, is strategic. It builds foundations that last generations. India has always had the potential to be more than just a participant in global affairs. It has the culture, the intellect, the population, the geography, and the resources to become a leader. But leadership is not about noise. It's not about reacting to every move another country makes. True leadership comes from focus. It comes from channeling energy into education, innovation, economic strength, and national unity. When a country becomes obsessed with how others are treating it, it loses sight of what it can become. It plays defense. But when it invests inward, in its youth, in its industries, in its research, and in its values, it begins to write its own destiny. Every minute spent reacting to an external comment, foreign policy shift, or diplomatic move is a minute taken away from building something that matters. India's power should not be defined by what the world says about it, but by what it creates, what it exports, and what values it stands for. A nation's real image is built at home, not abroad. If India creates world-class institutions, fair governance, digital transformation, clean energy solutions, and military readiness, then no amount of external criticism or manipulation will matter. The world notices results, not reactions. Economic strength is the first place this inward investment must go. India must become a place where businesses thrive, where startups emerge from every corner, where foreign investment is drawn not by desperation but by promise. A strong economy gives a nation options. It allows it to act, not just respond. It creates jobs, builds infrastructure, and raises the standard of living. When a country feeds itself, powers itself, and educates its people with its own hands, it becomes unshakable. Next is education. Not just textbook learning, but creativity, innovation, and practical skills. If India raises a generation of thinkers, builders, and problem solvers, then no nation can outpace it. When people are equipped with the right tools and mindset, they become assets, not just to the country, but to the world. They become messengers of strength, not just survivors of struggle. And then comes unity. A nation constantly divided from within cannot stand firm against forces from outside. India must invest in healing its divisions, religious, regional, economic, linguistic, and move toward shared purpose. The future does not belong to nations that fight themselves. It belongs to those that rise together. When every citizen sees their future in the nation's future, a collective force is born, one that no foreign alliance or opposition can destabilize. The media, too, must stop glorifying external validation and focus on internal excellence. The story of India should not be how it responded to an insult or reacted to a diplomatic shift. It should be how it built the next global tech giant, how it eradicated poverty in a decade, how it became a medical superpower, how it raised the world's most skilled professionals. That is a story the world respects and fears. And in defense, India should invest not just in weapons but in deterrence, in creating such a strong and advanced defense infrastructure that conflict never becomes an option for any enemy. The goal is not war. The goal is such readiness that war becomes unthinkable. In every area, the message is the same: build first, respond later, or better. Make your progress the only response needed. When you are strong inside, the noise outside fades. You no longer need to prove yourself to anyone. You are the proof. India does not need to convince the world of its greatness. It needs to become so great from within that the world has no choice but to acknowledge it. Reactions fade. Investments endure. What India builds today will decide whether it leads tomorrow. And that leadership must come not from reacting to the outside world, but from perfecting the world it creates within. Superpowers fear what they cannot control. That fear is not always loud or dramatic. It often hides behind diplomacy, aid, strategic cooperation, or even praise. But beneath the surface lies deep discomfort, because a nation that thinks for itself, acts on its own terms, and refuses to bend under pressure is unpredictable. And in geopolitics, unpredictability is the greatest threat to control. Control is the foundation of how global powers maintain influence. They build alliances, offer military support, invest in economies, and shape narratives, not out of goodwill, but to ensure that key regions remain under their guidance. When a nation begins to drift from that influence, when it starts making independent decisions, building its own economic power, strengthening its military, and inspiring its people, it becomes a variable outside of the equation. It becomes something that can no longer be managed through the usual tools of pressure or persuasion. That loss of control leads to fear because the superpower knows it is facing something it can no longer predict or manipulate. This is why emerging nations that refuse to follow the script are often targeted in subtle, strategic ways. They may not be attacked directly, but they will face increased scrutiny, economic pressure, diplomatic roadblocks, or media campaigns designed to paint them as unstable, aggressive, or problematic. The goal is not destruction, it is realignment. The fear is not that these countries will fail, but that they will succeed without help, that they will become examples for others, that they will prove it's possible to rise without being in someone's shadow. An independent nation with its own vision, strategy, and strength becomes a mirror. It shows other developing nations that submission is not the only path to progress. That message threatens the very structure of global dominance, which is built on the idea that only those who follow the rules of the powerful can succeed. But when a country breaks away from that narrative and begins to shape its own destiny, it weakens the control superpowers have over entire regions. This fear is especially intense when the rising nation is large, resource-rich, intellectually strong, and has a population with massive potential. Such a nation doesn't need constant assistance. It doesn't rely on foreign validation. And over time, it stops reacting to external pressure altogether. It starts acting based on internal goals. And that is when the superpower realizes they have lost their grip. Control is not about war or force alone. It's about influence through economics, media, military bases, cultural export, or strategic dependence. When those levers stop working, the dominant power starts to panic. They know that if one nation breaks free, others might follow. If one country proves that self-reliance works, the entire balance of control begins to shake. That is not just a geopolitical threat. It is an ideological one. Superpowers thrive on predictability. They build their strategies decades in advance. They rely on having partners that follow, not question. But when a nation becomes bold, confident, and unwilling to play that game, it becomes a wild card. A wild card cannot be managed. It can only be watched with caution and calculation. And this fear of the unknown, this fear of losing the ability to dictate terms, creates friction, tension, and often hidden opposition. The irony is that the more a nation becomes self-sufficient, the more it is criticized, isolated, or portrayed as aggressive. But these are not signs of failure, they are signs of independence. The louder the resistance, the greater the indication that control is slipping. And history shows time and again that those who break free from the grip of the powerful often face the storm before they reach the calm. But that storm is not a reason to stop. It is a sign that the path is working. Because superpowers do not fear the weak. They do not fear those who obey. They only fear those who grow beyond their reach, those who refuse to be ruled, those who write their own story. And once a nation begins to do that, truly do that, the world changes, not just for them, but for everyone watching. Unity, innovation, and internal growth are the ultimate shields. They protect a nation from more than just external threats. They protect it from dependence, from stagnation, from collapse under pressure. These are not abstract ideas. They are the foundations of lasting power. When a country is united, when its people share a sense of purpose and destiny, it becomes impossible to divide or weaken from the outside. No enemy, no superpower, no strategy can shake a country where the people believe in themselves and in each other. Division is the first step to defeat. A divided nation is easy to control. It fights itself while others take advantage. But unity transforms that weakness into strength. Unity does not mean uniformity. It means the ability to look past differences for the sake of progress. It means building a national identity so strong that regional, religious, or cultural divides cannot tear it apart. When unity is real, internal conflicts shrink, trust increases, and the entire population moves forward together, not as separate communities, but as one force. But unity alone is not enough. It must be paired with innovation. In today's world, ideas are the new weapons, and creativity is the new defense. A country that can innovate cannot be cornered. It finds solutions when others see problems. It creates products, industries, and systems that the world cannot ignore. Innovation is not just about technology. It's a mindset. It's the ability to look at old problems in new ways, to disrupt, to lead rather than follow. When innovation becomes a national culture, a country doesn't just catch up with the world. It defines where the world goes next. Innovation fuels independence. It removes the need to import knowledge or wait for external approval. A nation that builds its own tools, its own medicines, its own technologies becomes sovereign in the true sense. That kind of power is hard to stop because it cannot be taken away. It is grown, not granted. And with every new invention, every breakthrough, the country becomes more capable, more confident, and more influential. And then comes internal growth, the engine behind everything. When a country grows from within, economically, socially, and institutionally, it becomes a fortress. It is not wealth alone that matters, but where that wealth comes from and how it is used. A country that lifts its poor, empowers its middle class, builds infrastructure, invests in youth, and ensures fairness creates a cycle of stability that cannot be easily broken. Internal growth builds legitimacy. When people feel that their nation is working for them, they support it. They defend it. They give their energy to it. Internal growth also reduces vulnerability. It lessens dependence on foreign aid, foreign jobs, foreign validation. It ensures that even in a global crisis, the country can stand on its own. It builds systems that are strong, institutions that function, and citizens who believe in their nation. That belief, that deep-rooted trust in the country's direction, is a greater protection than any military alliance or foreign agreement. Together, unity, innovation, and internal growth form an unbeatable shield. They reinforce each other. Unity fuels innovation by creating shared purpose. Innovation drives growth by opening new opportunities. Growth strengthens unity by improving lives. This is a cycle of strength that no superpower can control and no enemy can break. External threats will always exist. Global politics will always shift. But a country that is united in its identity, bold in its ideas, and consistent in its development becomes untouchable. It may be challenged, but it will not be shaken. Because real security does not come from borrowed power. It comes from the strength a nation builds in itself. And once that shield is in place, the world cannot ignore it. It must respect it.